Who's going to win the Big 18? This is the first season with the Big Ten having 18 teams now that USC, UCLA, Oregon, and Washington have joined the Big Ten, and it's going to make an already tough Big Ten conference even tougher because not only do you have Ohio State, Michigan, and Penn State, the normal suspects at the top of the division, going to be competing for the crown, you've also got USC and Oregon that have a chance to win the conference as well, and Wisconsin, Iowa, and Washington are still teams to watch out for as well. So it's going to be a very tough Big Ten from top to bottom, even for teams toward the bottom of the conference that are fighting for bowl games. So I'm going to go over every single Big Ten team's football schedule this year and give my quick prediction on what I think their final record is going to be at the end of the season. Now, the first team to talk about is the Illinois Fighting Illini, and the betting odds only have them winning 5.5 games on the season, so they're not very high on them, even though Illinois had a good year under Brett Bielema a couple seasons ago, but they were not as good last year. And this year, they don't have the easiest schedule in the world because now the Big Ten West is gone, which is going to really hurt a lot of those teams from the Big Ten West now that all of the schedules are more even. The schedules won't be perfectly even, but still, they're going to be more even than they used to be. But Illinois doesn't have the worst schedule of all the teams in the Big Ten because they don't have to play Ohio State and USC, but unfortunately, they still got Penn State, Michigan, and Oregon. Those are still going to be tough games, most likely all losses. Then they have Kansas out of conference, which Kansas is a much better team than they were a decade ago now that Lance Leopold is now the head coach. All those games are probably losses. And then every other game I think Illinois will have a chance in, but it's not like Illinois is going to run the table and go 8-4 most likely. Luke Altmaier is a solid quarterback, but Illinois doesn't have the defense that they used to have, and they don't have enough weapons on offense. I think that they're going to split the remaining games in conference play that they will have a chance to win in and win those two non-conference games. So my final prediction for Illinois football is going to be 5-7. I think that the betting odds have it about right for the Fighting Illini. Then we got Indiana, and Indiana's a really interesting team because they have the exact same betting line for the season at 5.5 wins as Illinois. But Indiana, I am much higher on than Illinois because the Hoosiers got a new head coach, and his name is Curt Cignetti. And I already made a full video on the Indiana Hoosiers if you guys would like to go check that out. Link is in the description. But the Hoosiers, they're going to have a much better year because they brought in a ton of talented players through the transfer portal from James Madison and other places. And their schedule is a whole lot easier than Illinois' because of the fact Indiana is used to that Big Ten East gauntlet. Now they don't have as tough of a schedule. They do have Michigan and Ohio State on the schedule, which both those are probably going to be losses. But every other game, the Hoosiers will have a chance in. I don't think they're going to be able to win every single game that they have on the schedule. They're not going to go 10-2. It's not like Indiana is going to be that good. But if they can win that at UCLA game to start out the Big Ten Conference slate in the Rose Bowl, all they have to do out of the remaining 6 games is win 3 of them, and that would put them at 7-5. And with teams like Maryland, Purdue, and Michigan State on the schedule, who I think Indiana might be better than this year, I'm going to go with the Hoosiers winning 7 games this season. I think they're going to go 7-5, and it's going to be a success in Curt Cignetti's first season with the Indiana Hoosiers. Then we have the Iowa Hawkeyes, and the betting odds for Iowa only have them at 7.5 wins on the year. But a lot of people are higher on Iowa than most because Iowa's schedule is actually very easy, even though they're no longer in the Big Ten West. They have been gifted a good schedule in their first season of being in the divisionless Big Ten with all these new teams. Because they're non-conference slate, yes, they have Iowa State, but it is going to be at home for Iowa, so that always helps. If they can win all 3 of their non-conference games, Ohio State's the only game they're most likely going to lose, but then they have at Minnesota. Iowa has owned Minnesota the last decade. They got Washington at home. They do have Maryland on the road and Michigan State on the road, but neither of those two teams are all that good. And then they got Wisconsin and Nebraska at home. I think that Iowa, because their schedule's very easy, even with a bad offense, I still feel like Iowa's going to be a little bit better on offense this year since Brian Ferentz is fired. They're still not going to be good, though, but that defense is going to make up for all the flaws. I'm going to have Iowa going 9-3. If they had a harder schedule, I would have them losing more games, but I do think they're going to have a good season because of that relatively easy schedule. Then up next, we have the Maryland Terrapins, and the Terps, they think are going to win 7.5 games this year, which, to be honest, looks a little bit high on paper because of the fact that Maryland doesn't have Tua Tagovailoa's younger brother anymore. He's gone, and they got Billy Edwards Jr. at quarterback, so he's going to be a big question mark. Will he be able to go out there and have success? Yes, Maryland has some weapons still on their team, but they did lose a lot of guys to the NFL draft the past few years at wideout and on defense. And Mike Locksley, I think he's a solid coach, but still overall, I don't think that he is one of the better coaches in the Big Ten. They have USC, Oregon, Iowa, and Penn State on their schedule. All those games could be losses, and then they have tough games at Indiana, at Virginia in the non-conference. I know Virginia is not all that good right now, but still not going to be the easiest game in the world. At Minnesota as well. I feel like Maryland can go undefeated in non-conference play if they can knock off Virginia. If they can beat Michigan State, knock off Northwestern and Rutgers, that would put them at 6-6. I feel like Maryland will be able to win 6 games because Mike Locksley's been doing a good job of getting them to bowl eligibility, but I don't see them winning any more games than that. Then up next, we have Michigan State. The Spartans have fallen hard since that brief high of the Mel Tucker era when they had Kenneth Walker and they went 11-2 that year. They've fallen off since then, and now they do have a new head coach in Jonathan Smith, which a lot of people are high on, just like Curt Cignetti, because Jonathan Smith did a fantastic job at Oregon State, taking a program that does not normally win and winning a ton of games with them. It's very unfortunate for Oregon State that they lost them, but Oregon State's not even really in a conference right now, so you can't blame him for leaving, and he's making more money at Michigan State. When you look at Michigan State's schedule this year, it's very interesting because on the one hand, they've got tough games against Ohio State, Oregon, Iowa, and Michigan, but then all the other games look pretty manageable. In the non-conference, they do have a game against Boston College on the road. That's a 50-50 game. They can win that game, but I could also see them dropping it too because Boston College does have Bill O'Brien as a new head coach as well, which is bringing some new life into that program. And then they also have games against Indiana, Illinois, Purdue, and Rutgers. If they could split those 4 games and win 2 of them and can find a way to beat Boston College in the non-conference, that would put them at 5 wins. And then that at Maryland game, that's the swing game. But still, Maryland looks a little bit ahead of Michigan State right now. I know Aiden Childs is a very talented quarterback, but I'm going to go with Michigan State only going 5-7 this year. I just don't think they're going to make a bowl game in Jonathan Smith's first season. They have a tougher schedule than Indiana, and they have a lot more question marks on their roster that I think they're going to fall just short of a bowl game. Michigan is up next, and this is our first team we're going to be talking about that has a chance to win the Big Ten. Michigan's lost a lot. They have more departures of any team in the Big Ten from this past season when it comes to the draft, losing all those talented players and Jim Harbaugh as well. And they got the allegations against their program, kind of a cloud over that national championship season. But they do have Sharon Moore, who was the interim coach last year that kept them afloat when Harbaugh was suspended. He's now their head coach. And they have Alex Orji is probably going to be their starting quarterback. He's a very talented player, but he is a flawed passer, so it's going to be very interesting to see how he does out there on the field, if he cannot be like Anthony Richardson and be a little bit better at completing passes, or whether he's going to be very turnover prone. When you look at the Wolverine schedule, that Texas game's going to be huge. It's at home. If they can win that game, then that's going to show that Michigan is probably going to be one of the 10 best teams in college football next season. But if they can't win that game, then it's going to be much harder to see them beating Ohio State for the 4th season in a row and knocking off Oregon as well. And they got that game against USC that's not going to be that easy either. I do feel that Michigan's going to take a bit of a step back next season. They're going to have a talented defense, but their offense is not going to be as good. I know they have Donovan Edwards back. He's a talented player, but he's not as complete of a back as Blake Corum. I see with all of Michigan's schedule, I feel like that they're probably going to go 9-3. I almost would say 10-2, but with those games against Texas, Oregon, and Ohio State, and possible slip-up games against USC and Washington, I just feel like Michigan's ceiling is to go around 9-3. And then up next, we have the Minnesota Golden Gophers, and we got a coach on the hot seat. Everybody's talking about Billy Napier and how he's basically toast as the Florida head coach with how tough their schedule is. If he can't even win 5 games, he might not survive. But PJ Fleck's in big trouble too, because Minnesota won 11 games a few years ago, and he was doing a fantastic job early in his tenure, but Minnesota's fallen off recently. They're not as good, and the betting odds only have them winning 4.5 games this year. But when you look at Minnesota's schedule, you can kind of see why the betting odds only have them winning 4.5 games. All of their easier games are on the road, at UCLA, at Illinois, at Rutgers, at Wisconsin. Minnesota is a much better team when they're at home in front of their home crowd, rowing the boat up there. And it's going to be a lot harder for them being on the road in those games against teams that they probably would have a better chance to beat if they were at home. They do start off with North Carolina at the beginning of the season on Thursday night. If they can beat North Carolina, that would give Minnesota a chance to make a bowl game. But if they can't win that game, then all those swing Big Ten road games will be huge. And then they also have Penn State, USC, Michigan, and Iowa on the schedule. There's a lot of tough games on the schedule. I think with the energy and history that PJ Fleck has as a coach, I feel like he could get Minnesota to 6 wins, but with all those tough swing games on the road, and then also games against Iowa, Michigan, USC, and Penn State, I feel like the max Minnesota can do is 5-7. Maybe they can beat Rhode Island and Nevada and possibly be able to knock off UCLA, Rutgers, and maybe North Carolina, but at the end of the day, that is the best I feel Minnesota can do. Then up next, we have Nebraska. Nebraska is a very interesting team because some people think that this is the year that Nebraska is finally going to get back on track. They're going to make a bowl game. Matt Rule is going to start getting the Cornhuskers trending again in the right direction, and they do have some talent. Dylan Raiola, the former Georgia commit, did go to Nebraska. That was a massive addition for Nebraska, whether Kirk Herbstreit helped with it or not. But still, Nebraska does have some good fortunes going their way, and their schedule isn't too ridiculously hard either. Ohio State, USC, and Iowa are their toughest games. They do have Wisconsin at home. But other than that, Colorado is their toughest non-conference game, and we know that Deion Sanders does not really have Colorado in a great place right now. They still have a lot of work to do to become a good program. UTEP and Northern Iowa should be wins. And then Illinois, Purdue, Rutgers, and Indiana, and UCLA could all be wins for Nebraska. That would already get them to 7 wins. And if they can knock off Wisconsin, that would get them to win number 8. I don't know if they're going to be able to win every single one of those games, but I will say that Nebraska has a better team this year. I don't trust them really to win 8 games, though, because of the amount of failures Nebraska's had the last few years. But I will go with 7-5 for the Cornhuskers. Their schedule's easy enough. I think they'll blow it in a couple games they shouldn't, but I do think the Cornhuskers are going to have a better year. Then up next, we got the Northwestern Wildcats, and it's unfortunate for Northwestern that the Big Ten West is gone because they were having success with David Braun, and they also had success with Pat Fitzgerald in plenty of seasons that he was the head coach. But now that there's no more divisions, that's going to make it a lot harder on a team like Northwestern. I don't know if they're going to be able to have as much success as they would have had if divisions were still intact. But when you look at their schedule, though, it's not the worst. Michigan, Ohio State, and Iowa are their toughest games. Washington's not easy, but then they got Duke out of conference. Duke is a massive game for Northwestern. If they can beat Duke, they might be able to make a bowl game. Duke doesn't have Mike Elko anymore either. They got Manny Diaz, so that might make that game a little bit easier. Indiana, Maryland, and Illinois, and Purdue are all possible wins, but they're not going to win all those games. I don't see them beating Iowa, Ohio State, and Michigan. They'll probably split the remaining games, so I'm going to go with Northwestern probably beating Miami, Eastern Illinois, and maybe they can knock off Illinois, Purdue, and possibly Duke. That would put Northwestern at around 5 wins. I think they could maybe make a bowl game because I think David Braun is a guy that can get more out of less talent based off what he did last year, but I don't see Northwestern making a bowl game at the end of the day. Ohio State's up next, and a lot of people think Ohio State has a chance to win it all this year. We'll have to see. I'm not ready to say that at the beginning of the season that Ohio State's that good, but they do have Quinshon Judkins transferring from Ole Miss. Will Howard's their new quarterback. Even though I don't think he's a massive upgrade from Kyle McCord, he does have some running ability, and a lot of people think that his leadership skills are better than Kyle McCord as well. But I'd still think his upgrade is slim over McCord, but it doesn't really matter if the rest of the team is that great. Ohio State also added Caleb Downs on defense from Alabama. All those are huge additions. Their non-conference slate's laughable. Akron, Western Michigan, and Marshall. All 3 of those games are going to be easy wins for Ohio State. Michigan State, most likely an easy win. Their tough games are at Oregon, at Penn State, and Michigan. All the other games should be wins. Even the Iowa one, more than likely for Ohio State. I think there is a chance they drop either the at Oregon game and the at Penn State game. And if they do drop one of those games, I think it's going to make Ohio State hungry to beat Michigan even more so because Ryan Day does not want to drop 2 games. That would make him look really bad in front of the Ohio State fan base. So Ohio State, I think at max they're going to lose 1 game in the regular season. I don't know which one it's going to be, whether it's Penn State, Oregon, or Michigan, but I do think they will drop 1 game. They're not going to go undefeated. They could drop 2, but my record prediction for Ohio State in 2024 is going to be 11-1, and the betting odds say that they're going to win 10.5 games. So definitely they are high on Ohio State as well. So that's where I think they'll end up. Then you got Oregon. Oregon's a newcomer to the Big Ten, coming over from the Pac-12, and people are high on Oregon because of the addition of Dylan Gabriel. Dan Lanning did a massive job getting him in the transfer portal. He has some of the most accolades of any quarterback in college football right now with the amount of success that he had at Oklahoma and UCF. He's put up ridiculous stats. He's a veteran. I think that Oregon's offense is going to be elite in 2024, but it's going to be tough for them joining a new conference, playing all these new teams. But their schedule schedule isn't too bad. They have Michigan on the road and Ohio State at home. And then all of their other games are against unranked teams. If they can sweep the board against all of those teams, which I think they can do, then it comes down to whether you believe that Oregon can knock off Ohio State on their own field and beat Michigan on the road. I almost feel like it would be better for Oregon if they had Michigan at home and Ohio State on the road. Then it would make it more certain that Oregon would only lose one game, because with Ohio State coming to Autzen Stadium, that could still be a loss for Oregon, and it's going to be tough to play in the Big House at Michigan. So Oregon, they could lose 2 games, and that's actually probably what I'm going to end up going with for Oregon. If they were not a newcomer to the Big Ten and they had more experience playing these teams, I probably would go with 11-1, but I do think Oregon might go 10-2 as things stand right now. And then up next, we have the Penn State Nittany Lions. Penn State's always Michigan and Ohio State's little brother, it always seems, in the Big Ten standings. They're always right behind. Everybody's so frustrated to be a Penn State fan, even though they're basically better than 90% of other college football programs, but they just can't get to the top in the last 10 to 15 years. But Penn State has a 9.5 win total on the betting odds. And when you look at James Franklin, a lot of people say he can't win the big game, but he's actually done a good job in some games recently being able to knock off big opponents like Utah in the Rose Bowl, even though that was the game that Cam Rising went down. But still, Penn State has had some success in big games. They just can't knock off Ohio State. But a big reason why Penn State can't knock off Ohio State is they don't take risk in the passing game. But Penn State has a new offensive coordinator. They also have a new defensive coordinator in Tom Allen. But the big thing for Penn State is they start the year with a tough road test at West Virginia. If Penn State loses that game, it's going to wreck their season in a lot of Penn State fans' minds. But when you look at the rest of their schedule, their other tough games are at USC, at Wisconsin, and versus Ohio State. Other than that, the rest of their schedule looks like easy wins for Penn State overall. If they can beat West Virginia, then more likely you would believe they could beat Wisconsin on the road too, even though that still would be a tough game. And then it would come down to at USC and then Ohio State. I think Penn State has enough talent on both sides of the ball, and with Penn State having a new offensive coordinator, possibly being able to help open up the offense and give Drew Allar more chances to throw the ball downfield, I'm going to go with Penn State winning 10 games on the season, going 10-2, but they have to win that game at West Virginia to get it done. Then you got Purdue. A lot of people are low on Purdue this season because Ryan Walters is in his second year as the Purdue head coach. He did not have a good year for Purdue last season after Jeff Brom left, and Purdue's no longer in the Big Ten West. So they're going to have a tougher schedule to go up against most seasons in the Big Ten. And when you look at their schedule, they got Notre Dame out of conference and at Oregon State. They can lose both those games. Indiana State should be a win, but if Purdue wants to make a bowl game, they have to win at Oregon State. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. Probably need to win at Indiana as well. That's not going to be as easy now that Curt Cignetti's there. They also have at Michigan State on the road, at Wisconsin, at Illinois, Nebraska at home. This is not an easy schedule for Purdue, and even though Purdue has tried to make some transfer additions, they did not make as big of a splash in the portal as some of these other Big Ten programs. I don't know. I think Purdue might go 3-9. This is not an easy schedule for Purdue. All of their games are in the worst spots. They might only win against Indiana State, and maybe they can knock off Northwestern and possibly either Oregon State or Illinois. Other than that, I just don't really think that Purdue's going to have all that good of a year. So my record prediction is 3-9. Then we have Rutgers, and Rutgers is the exact opposite of Purdue. A lot of people are high on Rutgers because they have a very easy conference slate. Most people are thinking maybe they can win 6 or 7 games, and the betting odds have them at 6.5 wins. When you look at their out-of-conference slate, Howard and Akron should be wins. At Virginia Tech is a tough, sneaky, underrated game in college football because Virginia Tech should be improved. That's a 50-50 game. Then when you look at their conference slate, they do have USC, and that's it. That is their only game against a ranked team as things stand right now. All their other games are against unranked opponents. Yes, at Nebraska is a tough game, and at Maryland isn't easy, but Washington, Wisconsin, UCLA, Minnesota, Illinois, those are all at home. So Rutgers, I think they're going to win 7 games. If they don't win 7 games, and Greg Schiano being as good of a coach as he is, that would be a disappointment. I know Rutgers doesn't have the best offense, but against that schedule, they have to win 7 games. I'm going 7-5. Then UCLA, they're like Purdue. They have a brutal schedule. Now they're joining the Big Ten in their first season. This is a bad time for it because Chip Kelly's gone. Deshaun Foster is his first season as the head coach, and they have a lot of roster turnover. Things are just not looking all that good for the Bruins. They have LSU out of conference. That's terrible for UCLA. That's not the right season for them to have that game. Yes, UCLA beat them a few years ago when they had Dorian Thompson-Robinson, but this is not the same UCLA team now. They also have Fresno State and Hawaii. Maybe they can win both those games, but Fresno State won't even be that easy. Then they have Indiana. That game against Indiana is massive. If they can win that game, maybe they can make a bowl game, but they've got Oregon, Penn State, Iowa, USC in the Big Ten schedule, at Washington, at Nebraska, at Rutgers. I don't know, man. I think UCLA is kind of screwed like Purdue. I think they're only going to go 3-9. They just have way too tough of a schedule, an inexperienced coach, and not enough talent for me to think that they're going to have a whole lot of success. Then up next, we got USC, and the betting odds only have them at 7.5 wins. And you could be like, why is USC that low? They have a lot of talent. Miller Moss, even though he's a bit of an unproven quarterback, he had a lot of success against Louisville in the bowl game. Lincoln Riley's a great offensive mind. They got rid of Alex Grinch, so their defense should be better, but their schedule's not that easy. LSU to start the year is a tough game in week 1. Then they have at Michigan. That's a hard game in the Big House, a game that most people probably do not think USC is going to win. They have Penn State at home. Then they got Notre Dame to end the year. And then they got some tricky games at Washington and also at Maryland and Wisconsin and at Minnesota. I think USC should win all of those games, though. I'm just concerned about the LSU, Michigan, Penn State, Notre Dame, and really the at Washington game as well. The problem is USC got blitzed against Notre Dame last year. LSU seems to be ahead of USC right now on both sides of the ball, and at Michigan is going to be almost impossible, and they probably could split either the Penn State or the Washington games. I'm going to go with 8-4 for USC. If their defense I knew was going to be better, and they still had K.O. Williams, then I think USC would do better. But Miller Moss, even though he had a good bowl game against Louisville, I still don't trust him completely. I think he's going to have a little bit of growing pains. And then when you look at their defense, joining the Big Ten in the first season, it's going to have to take a massive improvement to knock off any of the big dogs in the Big Ten. I got USC going 8-4. Then our second to last team is the Washington Huskies. The Huskies, the over-under is 7.5. And if they still had Kalen DeBoer, that would be a whole lot higher for the Washington Huskies. But they lost Kalen DeBoer. They lost Michael Penix. They lost Roma Dunze. That's a lot of talent to lose. And Will Rogers is a good quarterback, and Jed Fish is a good coach. But Washington joining the Big Ten in the first season right now with all of these roster moves and coaching changes, it's just going to be tough for Washington to be really good in year one. When you look at their schedule, they got tough games against Oregon, Penn State, USC, Iowa, and Michigan. There's a chance they could lose every single one of those games. And even games at Indiana and at Rutgers aren't going to be that easy. I think that Washington is going to have a lot of growing pains in the Big Ten, but I still think that the roster is probably going to be good enough to beat Weber State, Eastern Michigan, and Washington State out of conference, possibly Northwestern, and I think they can beat UCLA as well. That's easily 5 wins. And then if they split against Rutgers and Indiana, that would get them to 6 wins, but if they can win both of them, that would give them to 7 wins. But I don't know. Something tells me Indiana is going to be too tough of a game. So I'm going to go with Washington to go 6-6 in their first season in the Big Ten, but possibly going to start doing better in year 2 and year 3 of being in the conference. And the final team we have on the list is the Wisconsin Badgers. And the over-under for Wisconsin is 6.5. A lot of people are low on the Wisconsin Badgers because the Big Ten West is gone, and now they're going to have a tougher schedule being in the divisionless Big Ten like the other Big Ten West teams. And they got Alabama out of conference, which more than likely will be a loss. I know it is at home. Maybe Wisconsin can find a way to sneak out an upset against Alabama, but I do think if Luke Fickell was in year 3 or year 4 of this rebuild with the Badgers, he'd have an easier chance to beat Alabama. But it's going to be very tough for them to knock off Alabama in just his second year with the Badgers. Still a lot of roster building that he has to do. And then Wisconsin also has Oregon, Iowa, Penn State, and USC. That's automatically 5 losses if Wisconsin can't win any of those games. And then they have at Rutgers and at Nebraska. Those are not easy games either. At Northwestern might not even be a slouch. I think that Wisconsin's kind of in the boat of Washington. I think that they're more talented than what their record's going to probably end up being, but Wisconsin might go 6-6. I think that their roster is good enough to maybe go 7-5 or 8-4, but because of the schedule and the growing pains that Luke Fickell is still experiencing transitioning the team from the Paul Chryst era, I think that the Badgers are only going to go 6-6. But those are just my preseason record predictions for every single Big Ten football team in 2024. Things could change. After a couple of weeks, we go look at a football team and they're playing a whole lot better than you would have thought at the beginning of the season, or some team you thought was going to be really good ends up starting out of the gate really rough, or a bunch of injuries happen and that team just isn't looking so good. So things can definitely change. And when we go week to week, probably by week 10 or 11, my thought processing on who I believe is going to win a certain game could definitely change based on how each team's season is going. But these are my thoughts on every single Big Big Ten team right now as we stand in the preseason, and we're so close to the return of college football, and I can't wait for the action to get started. But let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below about every single Big Ten team for 2024 and how good you think every single team is going to play, and whether you agree or disagree with my record predictions for every single Big Ten team. Subscribe to the channel if you like sports content. Like this video down below. Follow me on Twitter as well. Link is in the description, and I'll see you next time.